We're living through a decisive turning point in history. Tens of thousands of people are dying. The world economy is in freefall. This is the barbarism of the capitalist system. It can't be patched up. It must be replaced. We have the resources to meet everyone's needs and the planet's. A rational, planned, socialist economy is possible. A society based on need, not profit. But we have to fight for it. We need to get educated in revolutionary theory and history. We need to spread our ideas, and we need to organise ourselves. So join Socialist Appeal, the Marxist and the Labour and student movement. Join our study groups, spread our online material, and start getting organised with us. We're faced with an historic challenge and an historic opportunity. Seize this moment. Change the world.
But no time to delay. Victoria, please take us away on the German Revolution 1918 to 1990.
Hey, yeah. So I'll just go straight in then. So in November 1918, the German working class stormed the world scene of history in the wake of the Russian Revolution of 1917. And in a few weeks, they managed to bring down the Kaiser and the German Empire. The working class at this time was brimming with potential, and the situation was very much ripe for the workers to seize power and for there to be a proletarian takeover. Yet the socialist revolution, as I will come on to explain, would unfortunately not be achieved and would open the period in history for mass counter-revolution as well as other revolutionary events. Importantly, I think it's very important to note at the beginning that the reason why the revolution was not successful was not due to a lack of potential revolutionary spirit or ability to organise on the part of the working class. Rather, the revolution was sorely lost due to the mistakes made by the revolutionary leadership. There was an incredible amount to be learned from this period for any communist movement today, and we really have to try and learn from these errors to prepare for the future. We should look to the German Revolution, I think, as a source of inspiration. Although it was unsuccessful, it proves again the power of the working class and the potential for the overthrow of capitalism when led by a strong revolutionary leadership. So the year before, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, established the first workers' state in history in Russia. To the ruling class's dismay, the spectre of Bolshevism haunted Europe, and 1917 wouldn't see the end of these revolutionary events. In 1919, Lord George remarked, and I quote, "The whole of Europe was filled with the spirit of revolution." And true enough, the German revolutionary period of 1918 to 1923 was part of a revolutionary wave that spread across Europe following 1917. And I think the outbreak of revolution in Germany in particular was very powerful, a powerful inspiration to the Russian masses. And they were very keen to expand the proletarian revolution westwards and break their isolation. So Lenin and the Bolsheviks correctly understood that the epicenter of the European Revolution would not itself be in Russia, but in industrially advanced Germany, and I will come on to explain why. Russia, in this sense, merely took the first step, but the decisive battle for the victory of the European Revolution was fought in Germany. And as predicted, as I've said, between 1918 and 1923, Germany became the epicenter of world revolution and was key for the international situation and would kind of open up this period in history that was very much dictated by it for the next decades. The revolution encompassed millions of people. Most of them were brought into political activity for the first time. And the majority, as was seen in Russia, tended to gravitate towards the political parties they already knew. So in Germany, this tended to be the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD, and to a lesser extent, the Independent Social Democratic Party, so the USPD. But only through practical experience over the course of the revolution would the masses learn that neither of these leaders of the SPD or the USPD could solve their problems, and it would fall on the shoulders of a great Marxist revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg, and those close to her, to attempt to lead the masses to liberation. Rosa Luxemburg, along with a handful of other revolutionaries, including Lenin and Trotsky, James Connolly, James McLean, all of which they were very true to the ideas of internationalism on a world scale. And they defended the fundamental ideas. So these were the class nature of the imperialist war, the class nature of the state, the right of nations to self-determination, and the need for socialist revolution. Luxemburg, along with Karl Liebknecht and a small network in the SPD, fought against the pro-war policies of the leadership of the SPD. Luxemburg and Liebknecht, in particular, fought tirelessly for the socialist revolution in Germany and would be the key leaders for the revolutionary workers. However, they would be brutally murdered by the Freikorps in January 1919, which saw the beginning of a very intense period of counter-revolution. Since the revolution, Rosa Luxemburg's ideas have been loathed and adored. They've been distorted by Marxist critics to attack Bolshevism, and equally misinterpreted by left reformists and liberals alike, who try and claim her and view her as their own and not a Marxist. But I think it's important when discussing the German Revolution to be quite clear on this. Luxemburg was indeed a Marxist. She dedicated herself wholeheartedly to the aims of world socialist revolution. She was a key theoretician of the SPD, and I think it's safe to acknowledge she did make mistakes in theory, but these came from genuine revolutionary considerations. And I think despite the mistakes, she was still regarded and should be regarded as a key role in the situation. Lenin, for instance, regarded her with admiration, and I quote him saying, "She was and remains for us an eagle." It's also important to note the mammoth task that faced Luxemburg at the time. I don't think this can go unacknowledged. So during a revolution, the consciousness of the masses can change very, very quickly. But for them to take power, history shows that a revolutionary party, like the Bolsheviks, is necessary to provide them with the correct leadership. And what had taken the Bolsheviks two decades to build, Luxemburg was attempting to build in a few months. And I think, it's near impossible to assemble a revolutionary organization on such a scale in the midst of a revolution because events are changing so quickly. Nevertheless, this was the mammoth task in front of Luxemburg. And I think to this day, although mistakes were made in theory, and we acknowledge those and we learn from them, she remains the most outstanding representative of the Marxist left in Germany and a remarkable figure internationally. So, as well as the ideas of Luxemburg, the revolution itself has been distorted by bourgeois historians. They present it as an isolated accident, as not a genuine revolution, and sort of every attempt in the book to kind of make the masses forget that it was what it was, a revolution. So to dispel these distortions, I will explain how the revolution was not an isolated accident, but the result of accumulating discontent amongst the workers, which erupted in a powerful movement of the working class. And for us, this is a revolution. A movement of the workers is a revolution. And the discontent among the workers would have found its expression sooner or later. World War I was simply the trigger that unleashed the masses, but if it wasn't the war, another event would have triggered the movement of the working class. The German working class was also the most powerful body of workers in history. And as I said, all attempts to distort the truth about the revolution are merely done out of fear of the potential of what an organised and united working class can achieve. And to fully understand this, we have to return to sort of a few decades before the revolution itself, to the founding of the Social Democratic Party and the growth of the workers' movement. So, as we know, Germany was the original birthplace of Marxism, and it was there that Marx and Engels developed the ideas of scientific socialism. And like Marxism, this is the scientific method for achieving socialist revolution. Marx and Engels paid close attention over the years, whilst in exile, to the growing workers' movement in Germany. But prior to 1860, there was no real organised labour movement. Yet it was the preparatory work of Marx and Engels that laid the groundwork for the organisation of the German proletariat. In the 1860s and 70s, two socialist parties would come to the fore, one based around the ideas of Ferdinand Lassalle and another on the ideas of August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht, and this was the Eisenach Party. The latter very much followed in the legacy and the ideas of Marx and Engels, while the former had very progressive but confused ideas. In 1875, the founding Congress of the SPD was held, uniting the parties, and it was seen very much as the embodiment of revolutionary social democracy. Marx and Engels would go on to maintain the revolutionary line of the party and to combat the influence of figures such as Lassalle and the revisionist ideas of Jürgen Düring. And it would go on to become a model party, in the words of Lenin, and it became the most powerful section of the Second International. For instance, by 1912, the SPD had reached the height of its power, and the socialist revolution seemed assured. There were 1 million members, millions more supporters, making it the biggest party that adhered to Marxism in the world. In the 1912 election, the SPD achieved 4.3 million votes, and this was about 1/3 of the electorate. Meanwhile, the trade unions, which were organised by the SPD, had around 3 million members or more, making them amongst the largest in the world, all of which was a reflection of the general strength of the German proletariat. However, it's important to note, the power was in the hands of a reactionary autocracy. Despite the Reichstag, the power rested with the German emperor until 1918, and this was alongside the landed Prussian nobility known as the Junkers. The Reichstag was little more than a talking shop in this sense. It was, in the words of Wilhelm Liebknecht, the fig leaf of absolutism. And the imperial government functioned then to serve the interests not only of the landed aristocracy, but the industrialists, financiers, and bankers, and meanwhile the masses had little say. Yet the rapid industrialization alongside the development in the SPD, and this was going on in the second half of the 19th century due to the unification of Germany in 1871, resulted in a massive growth of German capitalism. For instance, the expansion of German industry saw a decrease of workers employed on the land from 50% in 1870 to 33% in 1913. So this development, importantly, gave rise to a fresh, young working class who were unburdened by tradition, and they were given skills. They were very experienced, and they quickly developed a militant working class consciousness, as well as loyalty to their newly founded organizations, so the trade unions and the SPD itself. And this greatly influenced the social democratic movement. To curb this, however, out of fear, Otto von Bismarck, who was Chancellor at the time, introduced an anti-socialist law in October 1878, which outlawed and shackled the activities of the SPD and trade unions. The 12 years under this law saw around 1,500 activists imprisoned and 150 SPD newspapers shut down. Many socialists in this time escaped abroad, and from there, underground papers were edited, produced, and smuggled back into Germany. And these papers, they were passed hand to hand, worker to worker, and satisfied the growing thirst for radical ideas amongst the working class. To the dismay of Bismarck and the rest of the ruling class, the anti-socialist law only increased sympathy for the socialists instead of weakening them, and they emerged greatly strengthened. Social democracy grew massively in these underground conditions, and it became recognized as the focal point of opposition to the autocratic regime. This law, the anti-socialist law, was repealed in 1890, and the SPD capitalized on its growing popularity and support. By the 1890s, for instance, the SPD's popular vote was at 20%, but sort of due to this growth, the ruling class then wanted to crush the movement with violence, having failed to curtail it with legislation. But sort of in this, they were overruled by the German emperor, who feared a backlash from the workers. And Bismarck subsequently resigned as chancellor, and the democratic struggle at this time began taking on the character of a class struggle. By contrast, the growth of capitalism had more negative effects on the social democratic movement itself, particularly the leaders of the SDP and also the trade unions. And this was because social democracy was developing in a period of capitalist upswing, and it nurtured quite a conservative outlook of the top layer of the leaders. They became convinced of the longevity of capitalism, that it could grant reforms and that these were concrete, that the lives of the workers could be improved gradually and incrementally without the overthrow of capitalism. And because of this, instead of preparing the powerful German working class for the conquest of power, the leadership concentrated on winning reforms within the confines of capitalism. And eventually, the struggle for reforms became an end in and of itself. They lost sight of the ultimate aim of changing society, and over time, the actions of the SPD and trade union leaders became devoid of any revolutionary content or perspective. The language of socialist revolution was simply sort of brought out for May Days, but in their daily lives, the leadership had become accustomed to bourgeois society. The more they adapted to the capitalist system, the more their consciousness became conservative. And this became reflected in the party's programme. So in 1891, it consisted of a minimum and a maximum programme. While the former was linked to demands for reforms within the framework of capitalism, the latter argued for the ultimate goal of socialism, but in the indefinite future. And while these reforms importantly improved the lives of workers, the problem was that the programmes lacked a transitional bridge linking the two together. And there was nothing in this sense to help the masses in their daily struggles to find the path to socialist revolution. And I think it's important here again to emphasise our stance on reforms as Marxists. We recognise that the struggle to change society is completely unthinkable without the daily struggles of the workers, and that reforms in this sense are essential. They're an essential part of the struggle. They enhance the daily living and working conditions of the workers, and also importantly, their class consciousness. But as Luxemburg explained, they should be broached as a transitional bridge to the overthrow of capitalism. And I quote her in saying this: "The struggle for reforms is its means, the social revolution its aim." And it is necessary then to link reforms to the overthrow of capitalism, as what is given with the left hand can easily be taken with the right. And this was proven in 1923 when reforms that had been introduced in 1918, such as an 8-hour workday, were taken from the workers. For a time, I think August Bebel and Karl Kautsky, who was the leading theoretician of social democracy, fought to keep the revolutionary line. They would correct other leaders if they strayed too far from revolutionary socialism or internationalism. But despite this, and I think Lenin would come on to realize in 1914 what actually Karl Kautsky stood for. He was more of a left guise as the years went on to the right-wing bureaucracy within the SPD. And as such, the movement was being transformed from an instrument for socialist revolution into a reformist apparatus whose function was to mediate between the classes. The opportunist tendencies of the Labour leaders increased in the years before 1914, and this became glaringly apparent when war broke out and the SPD capitulated, and in doing so they betrayed the Socialist International and the working class. So at the beginning of the 20th century, opposition to war and militarism became burning questions, and a resolution was passed at the International Congress in 1907. It declared that the International's main role was to prevent war breaking out, that they should, if it broke out, they should intervene to help it end quickly, and ultimately that they should use the sort of economic and political crisis that would be caused by war to rouse the masses and quicken the downfall of capitalism. However, this wouldn't be the case, and in August 1914, instead of making a collective call for international opposition, there was a capitulation by the SPD leadership. And this was seen across the International, not just in Germany. Other leaders began sort of casting off the working class in a sense and lining up behind the national bourgeoisie. So in August 1914, the Second International was shattered and the working class in Germany was handed over to imperialism and militarism. And this did mark a great betrayal by the SPD and trade unions. But I think there was a lot going on under the surface. So with the exception of a small minority who were fighting for genuine socialist revolution. And although this was a minority, this was around the likes of Luxemburg and Liebknecht, although this was a minority, under the surface, the process that Trotsky called the molecular processes of revolution was taking place. And at the beginning of the war, it seemed that the whole world supported it, but underneath the surface, the discontent and frustration began to build among the masses internationally and also in Germany. And the small network that was sort of forming around Luxemburg and also Mering within the SPD fought against the pro-war policies of the leadership. And Karl Liebknecht would sort of later join them. He was a parliament member in the SPD and had originally voted in support of the war credits along with the majority. But in December 1914, he broke away, becoming the sole SPD deputy in the Reichstag to vote against the war credits. And his decision here, it reflects an acknowledgement of the importance of opposing party discipline and voicing the opposition. In doing this, he became a symbol of the opposition against the war internationally. And the name Karl Liebknecht became known among the workers and soldiers in the trenches, throughout Germany, throughout other countries, as someone standing up against the slaughter of the workers all over Europe. And this dissent would spread rapidly throughout the party organization, and a larger opposition grouping within the SPD began to emerge. So in March 1915, 25 SPD deputies would vote against the war credits. This would rise to 36. And by December, around 43 of the 108 SPD deputies would go against party discipline and go against the war credits. Following this, the Liebknecht Mayor Luxemburg grouping or network would go on to hold their first Congress in January 1916 and launch the Spartacus Journal. And they became known at this point as the Spartakists, and from guiding principles drawn up by Luxemburg that were written by her when she was in prison and were smuggled out, they established the Spartacus League. And I said that this sort of discontent and discontent with the war was building within the party, and the surrounding layers. It was also very much so building throughout the masses. On May Day 1916, after agitation by the Spartakists in Berlin factories, a mass demonstration took place on the Potsdamer Platz with 10,000 workers coming out and demanding, "Down with the war, down with the government." During this, Liebknecht was arrested and he was sentenced to around 2 years, 6 months hard labour. But on the day of his trial, around, I think, 50,000 or more munitions workers walked out and demonstrations took place in Stuttgart, with strikes also in Bremen and Braunschweig. Hundreds of Spartacus workers were arrested during this, Luxemburg being one of them, and she was rearrested in July 1916 and wasn't released until the outbreak of revolution in November 1918. But, I think when a revolution outbreaks or when there is discontent, the ruling class kind of takes two options. They either go with repression and trying to repress the revolution at whatever means whatever means necessary, or they try and reform the situation, trying to appease the workers. And this was very much at this time the latter. They were trying to reform their way out of this situation by appeasing the masses. But this was too late, and this repression was too late. The consciousness of the masses was catching up, and this was just the tip of the iceberg. And the growing opposition amongst the workers to the horrors of war put enormous pressure on the rank and file of the SPD. It emboldened the opposition, not only within the Reichstag, but throughout the party. And in 1917, there would be a split in the SPD. Around 120,000 members were expelled, and they formed the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, so the USPD or Independents. And this brought Marxists and reformists together in the same party in their general opposition to the war. So, for instance, Luxemburg and Liebknecht, Marxists, were together with Kautsky, who was a reformist, and Bernstein, a revisionist. And despite their differences, they were now in the same party. This party was a centrist party, and it wavered between the ideas of Marxism and reformism. The Spartists in this grouping considered themselves an autonomous section. And the break of the independents from the SPD reflected a growing ferment within the ranks of the SPD, but also importantly in the ranks of the working class as a whole. Thousands of militant workers radicalized by the war and the effects of the February 1917 revolution in Russia flooded into this new party. By 1917, the German masses were also engulfed by the effects of the war. In the trenches, the soldiers were sickened by the bloodshed and the brutality, the physical effects of hunger, and the incompetence of the general staff. The lives of workers outside of the trenches weren't much better either. Given the economic blockade on Germany, the conditions of the working class in factories declined massively, and the winter between 1916 and 1917 was known as the turnip winter, and this was due to extreme food shortages, which meant that turnips were all that was left. And in this period, around 350,000 died from the combined effects of disease and hunger, while millions more were dying in the trenches. At this point, you get to November 1917 and the Russian Revolution. And the news of the Bolshevik success reached the international working class and had a profound and powerful effect on the consciousness of the masses, not just in Germany, but across the whole of Europe. In January 1918, Germany experienced the greatest strike of the war years. And this came as a series of other strikes, as I said, had happened over the years of the war. In the strike in 1918, over 1 million armament workers walked out against the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which the German regime had forced upon the Bolshevik government. And the growing revolutionary ferment at the front, combined with the strike waves in the city, cast a panic-stricken mood over the ruling class. To curtail the revolutionary mood, there was a reshuffle, and a parliamentary government was put in place with Prince Max von Baden at its head. Included in the ranks was Social Democrat Philip Scheidemann as an attempt to appease the masses. And in October 1918, when the revolution broke out, they released an amnesty for political prisoners, including the release of Karl Liebknecht, who was greeted by 20,000 Berlin workers. But again, this proved to be too little, too late. The workers were already sort of intent and moving forward. Throughout 1918, the military fronts had begun to collapse, and there were more than 4,000 desertions. On the 28th of October 1918, the German High Command tried to launch a naval battle on the North Sea to save the honour of the German Navy, risking lives of around 80,000 men. And this would prove, rightly so, to be the straw that broke the camel's back. The revolution of 1918 officially sort of erupted when workers mutinied in Kiel on November 3rd. Here, revolutionaries established a workers' and sailors' council taking control of the town. And importantly, this was done spontaneously of their own initiative. By the next day, power was firmly in the hands of the workers in Kiel, and red flags flew from imperial buildings. On the 6th, sailors, soldiers, and workers' councils took control in Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck, and by the 7th and 8th, councils were set up in 10 other towns and cities. A Berlin Executive Committee of Workers and Soldiers' Councils was then established and acted as a national centre. And in the absence of any other elected parliament or assembly, this was the most representative national body in Germany at the time. SPD leader Scheidemann stated, and I quote, "We have done all we can to keep the masses on the halter," end quote. But it would go on, much more would be needed to subdue the revolution, and these leaders would become very willing and obedient tools for this. Very quickly, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, and the right-wing Social Democrats stepped in to save the situation. Prince Max von Baden announced the abdication of the Kaiser on his behalf, because the Kaiser, he didn't want to hand over power, and Max von Baden turned to Friedrich Ebert, who was a social democrat, claiming, and I quote again, "If the revolution is on the verge of winning, we cannot crush it, perhaps we can strangle it." And he was very much fearful of Bolshevism and saw in Ebert the prospect of a republic instead. So they were trying with reforms from above to divert the revolution from below, and that they hoped they could stop the revolution from going too far and keep it within the bounds of a bourgeois revolution. So they got the majority in the councils and went into government with the USPD. And in some ways, this is kind of akin to the situation that happened in Russia after February. So there was a period where there was dual power between a bourgeois government and workers' councils led by moderate socialists or reformists. But the revolutionary tide was still sweeping across Germany, and the proletariat had begun to move. On the 9th of November, the Reichstag building surrendered without any violence or a shot being fired. And if the masses had wanted to at this time, they could have peacefully taken power, but they lacked a strong revolutionary leadership. In the absence of this, the workers turned towards the SPD and USPD for a way forward. But the revolution had also freed Rosa Luxemburg, and she went straight back into revolutionary activity and would play a seismic role. And Luxemburg sort of said, she came out and said that the SPD leaders were trying to diffuse the revolution by calling a national assembly. And instead, she thought the only way forward was for the workers and soldiers' councils to seize power. They had to follow the Russian example, which absolutely they should have. And they tried to. And at this point, the Spartacists, they were still a very small minority. They had only around 50 in Berlin, and others were scattered across the country. So they were a very loose network, and they were more than a discussion group, for instance, but they weren't by any means a professionally sort of disciplined, cadre-based Bolshevik organization. Yet when the revolution broke out, they attracted many to them, in particular the most radicalized layer of youth. And I think it's important to say that these leaders, those members of the Spartacists, they were very revolutionary, but they were also inexperienced and they were impatient. When they looked to the Russian example, they couldn't see the work or the steps taken by the Bolsheviks to prepare, only how they took power at the end through an armed uprising. This meant that they skipped over certain steps that the Bolsheviks had taken, importantly, to prepare, and skipped straight to the end goal, the workers seizing power. Importantly, as well, during a revolution, all layers of the working class are brought into action, not just the most radicalized layer. And many are very new to politics, and they won't jump straight to that conclusion that revolution is needed. They have to test the reformists in practice first and learn from practical experience that socialist revolution is the only way forward. And the role of the revolutionary leadership in this, as Lenin sort of instructed in Russia, is to patiently explain the necessity of socialist revolution. And this was the task of the revolutionaries in Germany. And Rosa Luxemburg definitely understood that and saw that. But for the others, it was very difficult to see. Lots of them, as I said, were new to revolutionary ideas, and they'd been thrown in sort of at the deep end, right into a revolutionary situation. But you have to admit that it was a mistake on the part of the Spartakists not to see what was needed and the steps that were needed to prepare. So within a few months of the revolution of 1918, the Spartakists broke with the USPD and formed the German Communist Party on New Year's Day 1919. And again, it was a very young group. The majority were under the age of 35. They were very swayed by ultra-left ideas. For instance, they voted against participating in the trade unions because they were dominated by the SPD. And this was a mistake, and Luxemburg opposed it, arguing instead that we have to work where the masses are in order to win them over. You know, if you remain outside the traditional working class organizations, you will just isolate yourself from the masses. You know, how can you reach them and explain your ideas to them about revolution, about the need for workers to seize power if you're apart from the masses? You know, on the one hand, because you won't have proven yourself to them by being in their struggle, they won't listen to you. So it's very difficult to influence them in that sense. But Luxemburg put this down to the teething pains of a new party, hoping that it could be rectified with time. However, as events would progress, they really didn't have enough time to do this. Within the first week of the foundation of the new party, their first test came. There was a clear polarization taking place within the USPD, who had left the government on the 29th of December. And the SPD tried to provoke the masses of Berlin and the revolutionaries by firing the police chief of Berlin, who was a member of the USPD. And he was seen by the workers as a defender of the working class. And in doing this, by firing him, the SPD hoped to provoke an immature uprising. And it did provoke one. The workers and soldiers of Berlin took to the streets again, staying there for several days, but there was no revolutionary leadership. A committee of revolutionaries was set up to deliberate what steps should be taken. But while they were discussing, the masses were out on the streets for days and then returned home because they didn't know what steps needed to be taken next. You know, importantly, without revolutionary leadership, the masses can only sustain such energy before losing steam. There needs to be a leadership to channel that energy, the energy of the masses, and lead events to their logical conclusions, which is the workers seizing power. Following this, the Freikorps, which was a very reactionary fascist group, was then set up by the SPD with the intention of crushing the revolution. As part of this, the witch hunt against the Spartakists was intensified, especially against Luxemburg and Liebknecht. And the line of the SPD was that the Spartakists were betraying the revolution, which of course wasn't the case. And on the 15th of January 1919, Luxemburg and Liebknecht were unfortunately found by these soldiers, and they were shot without defense. Luxemburg's body was then thrown into the Landwehr Canal in Berlin and wasn't found until May. But, you know, the revolution didn't end with them. 1918 was just the beginning of revolutionary events in Germany, and it opened up a 5-year period of intense revolution and counter-revolution. I don't have time to go into this aspect of the revolution, but it's safe to say that had events been different in 1918, the whole course of history would have been changed. And I will finish by reinforcing the importance of Rosa Luxemburg and the 1918 German Revolution for any communist movement today and for revolutionaries. Despite everything that happened, Luxemburg never forgot her belief in the working class and their power and ability to overthrow society. In a pamphlet written in January 1919, she wrote, and I quote, "Your order is built on sand. Tomorrow the revolution will rise up again, clashing its weapons, and to your horror it will proclaim with trumpets blazing, I was, I am, I shall be." And this is her legacy and the legacy of the German Revolution. It proved again that the workers could organise and move spontaneously, and that socialist revolution could spread internationally. The main problem in 1918, as I've said, was that there wasn't an organisation built on these ideas to actually intervene in the workers' movement when war and revolution broke out and lead it to its logical conclusions. Despite Luxemburg's mistakes, she may be excused because she and the Spartakists lacked the necessary experience or time to see the revolution through. But us today, we may not be excused, as we have the experiences of history sort of right in front of us to learn from. We have to learn from this moment in history and build a revolutionary organisation that is capable and strong enough to intervene in the workers' movement when the working class decide to move, which they will. The situation presently is even more favourable for a world socialist revolution now than when this event took place. The workers are stronger than ever, but they require a Marxist revolutionary leadership. And as we enter a new revolutionary period with capitalism in its deepest crisis to date, this is what we, as members of the MSF, are trying to build and prepare for today. But we need people to join us, and I would strongly urge those of you watching that agree with the ideas I've presented and that we will be discussing to do so if you haven't already. And Thomas will also explain this, but yeah, that's it for me. End of the talk.
Thank you very much, Victoria. That was absolutely brilliant, and I'm sure there were applauses going all across the country and the world for that incredible introduction to the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. So if you want to come in with contributions and different points, please raise your hands on Zoom or put a message in the chat. But just to reiterate that final point that Victoria made, is that history was in the balance in 1918. Just consider for a second what could have been if that revolution had been successful. The Russian Revolution would no longer have remained isolated, and the rise of Stalinism could have been prevented. The revolution could have easily spread to the revolutionary movements breaking out in Hungary, in Austria, in France, in Britain, even in Switzerland, experiencing a mass general strike in 1919. You know, the world was right. But instead, because there was no revolutionary party, there was no revolutionary leadership, and the attempts to build it had taken place not when they should have, not in 1902, nor in 1903, when these ideas of it became obvious that the SPD was going to be a reformist organization. But instead, in 1915 to 1919, we experienced the most barbarism on earth. The rise of fascism and of the Nazis and the horrors of World War II, the breaking out of nuclear war, and many of the things we experience today will come directly from the failure to build a revolutionary party and a revolutionary organization there. So if you don't want that to happen, I've just put a link in the box, and to join the International Marxist Tendency, which is trying to build these revolutionary organizations now, today, to prepare for these events. We're active in Britain, in of course, Socialist Appeal, in Germany, in Austria, in Canada, in the United States, in Pakistan, in Indonesia, in Venezuela, and all across the world. And I highly, highly recommend signing that form, actually fighting for these ideas. So on that note, I'm going to bring Joe Attard in first, followed by Sam Tollett and Khalid. And I'm just going to turn you into a panelist so we can all see your face while speaking. Joe. Hopefully that works. Yes, okay. One moment. Okay, Joe, please.
Hi, comrades. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm afraid you won't be able to see me because my webcam is broken, but there we are. I thought that was an excellent introduction, and I just want to echo something that was said about the significance of the German Revolution. I don't think that it's any accident that Lenin himself said that he would have sacrificed the Russian Revolution to save the German Revolution if he could. He recognized that given the industrial strength of the German working class, its impact on the global socialist revolution would have been immeasurable. And I think that it's no exaggeration to say that had these events gone differently, it would have completely altered the course of world history. I think that the revolution that bears important comparison with the German Revolution in terms of that turning point in history is the Spanish Revolution, which was similarly defeated and was seen as the last bulwark against the unstoppable rise of fascism across Europe. And both the German Revolution and its aftermath and the Spanish Revolution were characterized by the treachery and failures, both of the reformist leaders of the working class and the Stalinists. And if I might, I just want to go slightly beyond the remit of the lead-off and talk about the aftermath and the 1930s. in Germany. So obviously, after the betrayal of the German Revolution by the SPD, nevertheless, the party grew, and by 1932, it had 2 million members. Not only that, but it had an armed militia, the Iron Front. And Hitler reflected subsequently when talking about what could have stopped the rise of the Nazis in Germany. And he said, I think probably quite accurately, that had the organized working class been allowed to confront fascism through physical resistance, they would have crushed it in the cradle. But the SPD leaders were completely committed to parliamentary cretinism. They saw their role as holding back the working class and remaining respectable statesmen, a respectable opposition while out of power. And ultimately, they bowed to the pressure of lesser evilism and then ended up supporting bourgeois politicians in the Weimar Republic and Reichstag, rather than building an independent workers' opposition based on the organic forces of the working class, which in Germany was stronger than pretty much anywhere else in the world. The German working class was the most developed, it was the most class conscious, and more to the point, it was willing and ready to fight. There was a huge amount of pressure from below by the rank and file cadres of the SPD to confront fascism, that was unfortunately denied, and that was a big part of what allowed Hitler to come to power without breaking a window pane, as he bragged later. And for the Stalinist part, at that point, the Comintern was following its insane third period position, which basically argued that the greatest threat to the workers' movement internationally was what they described as social fascism, i.e., the social democracy. So rather than the workers' organizations, KPD and SPD, presenting a united front to fascism, the KPD sent its cadres to break up SPD meetings. They even allied with the SA at times in order to disrupt strikes. It was a really disgusting display. And it really was the joint forces of reformism and Stalinism that facilitated the ultimate victory of fascism in the 1930s. And I think it really underlines the point that came out in the discussion reflecting on 1918 to 19 German Revolution, that it was true. Well, it's true when we say that the history of the workers' movement turns on the failures of the leadership of the working class. And the last point I want to make is to counter this disgusting slander that you hear from bourgeois and liberal historians alike to this day, that the working classes were the basis of fascism. We still hear echoes of it when liberals bang on about the white working class and their support for Brexit and the fact that they're chauvinistic and nationalistic and racist and so on. The organized working class in Germany never gave more than a few percentage points to the Nazis. This we know for certain. It was the middle classes, the big middle classes and the small middle classes, the industrialists who wanted a bulwark against Bolshevism, well, not Bolshevism, certainly against communism, after the Great Depression, and the petty bourgeois, the white-collar workers, the teachers, and the students who were the organic basis of fascism. But I think that history should give us a great deal of optimism, because today the balance of forces has much changed. Students and white-collar workers are incredibly proletarianized, and indeed students are considered to be a bastion of left-wing politics, some of the first into the breach when there are major social movements. And the forces of the working class are significantly increased from 1918 certainly, and also from the 1930s. And I think that when we're entering into this new period of world history, where potentially a new Great Depression is looming, when you have huge political polarization, a great deal of social and political tumult, I think we should not look back on the German Revolution in 1918 and the situation in Germany in the 1930s with pessimism. I think there are lessons in those historical events. I think that there are lessons we can derive, and I think that there are notes of caution. But we should look upon the situation today with a great deal of optimism, because the working class is immeasurably strengthened, both in terms of its numerical strength and in terms of its cultural level. So the organic basis for a socialist revolution today are far greater than in the past. And we should draw inspiration from the inspiring struggle of the German working classes to transform German society and also the world political situation as we continue to fight for a just and fair socialist future for humanity today.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that excellent contribution.
Mm.
So I'm now going to take Sam, but before I do, I would also like to remind everyone watching that they can submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom, and then after Sam, or possibly after Karl, Victoria may come back on a few before some more contributions. So without further ado, Sam, can you please feel free to give your contribution?
Oh, sorry.
There we go.
Oh.
Hello, we can hear you.
Hi, I think we were both clicking that at the same time. Hello. So yeah, I think the German Revolution is really important to study. I think there's really important lessons we can learn from the time we are now, because you know, we all study very closely the act of Rosa Luxemburg, how the revolution of 1918 to 19, how that went down, because that's such a good example of, you know, the various the tactics that you can use in a very acute period of revolution. But I think it's also important to look at the whole decade after that, because the Germany wasn't lost to socialism after the defeat of the 1919 revolution and the murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. In fact, it wasn't really lost. The organized working class wasn't truly defeated until really Hitler was able to secure power in 1933. Up until that point, you have like a number of revolutionary movements from the waves of strikes and insurrectionary activity, even when France occupied the Ruhr area, up until, as Joe mentioned, the fight against fascism towards the late 20s and the 30s. All of these actions could have resulted in a successful revolution if they had the right leadership. Unfortunately, there were many people in the leadership of the German Communist Party didn't learn from the defeat of the 1919 revolution, and this was and in fact sort of ended up taking sort of almost the wrong conclusions in overcorrecting in sort of both opportunist and then ultra leftist directions, saying we have to water down our program too much to be acceptable to people. And when that failed, swinging in an ultra leftist direction and advocating for insurrections and not working with other workers' parties. And this was made worse by the actions of the sort of a degenerated Comintern, which didn't really help. So I think, in the revolutionary period we're moving into, we might see revolutions that are defeated, but we can't draw the wrong conclusions. We can't be too sort of empirical or demoralized about that. We have to take a longer term view, like a Marxist view, which looks at this sort of scientifically, these actions scientifically, and is able to build the leadership necessary to win the next revolution.
Thank you very much, Sam. I think that's a very good point, especially as we can see that very much in the what's going on in the Labour Party today, where many people have drawn the conclusion that the defeat of Corbyn now means it's all over. The right wing are going to be in the ascendancy, and we're never going to have socialism in Britain at all. Which I think is a very, very extreme view to take, but also again fails to see that this is an ongoing struggle which happens again and again and again. Okay, I'm now going to take Karl, and then if afterwards Victoria can come back with a few of the questions and a few of the points, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, there we go.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that talk, Victoria. It was excellent. I wanted to talk a little bit about Rosa Luxemburg and her relations with Lenin, because I think many on the left don't dispute that they were both revolutionary giants, but there is a tendency to simply valorize one or the other, which I think we should be cautious of. And also we find, people stressing their differences without actually taking into account their similarities. And so, like, before the outbreak of the First World War, the dangers of war had been discussed prior by the Social Democrats of the day, as you mentioned. It was at the Stuttgart Congress that they approved an amendment moved by Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg that basically said, in the case that war should break out, it is the duty of Marxists to intervene, to utilize the economic and political crisis created by the war to rouse the masses and thereby hasten the downfall of capitalist rule. And this is something that they both stuck to, and it formed the basis of Lenin's revolutionary defeatist position. As Victoria said, they both defended an internationalist perspective through and through, and waged an unerring battle against opportunism within the socialist movement. But this point of disagreement, I think, which tends to be forever stressed, originates with an article Luxemburg wrote under the neutral title of Organizational Questions of Russian Social Democracy. And this article, funnily enough, was republished in English under the misleading title of Leninism or Marxism. Clearly in order to imply that it's either one or the other, or that there's a certain antagonism between the two. And it's in this article that Luxemburg argues against Lenin's alleged ultra-centralism and dictatorial methods. But Lenin's reply to this article, which actually explained how this was a caricature of Bolshevism, which was being put forward by the Mensheviks, was blocked by Kautsky. He refused to print it. But Luxemburg's position was no accident. She had good reason to be suspicious of centralism, because for many years, as Victoria explained, she'd been conducting a stubborn struggle and tended to find herself isolated in it against the bureaucratic and reformist tendency in the German Social Democratic Party. She oversaw this huge crystallization of a vast swathe of trade unionists and, party practicos, the committeemen, into a solidly conservative bloc. But I think from reading this article, it's clear that Luxemburg was never really polemicizing against the ideas of Lenin or the ideas of Bolshevism for that matter, but the kind of bureaucratic reformist degeneration with which she was all too well acquainted in her own party. And as a reaction against this, Rosa Luxemburg laid heavy stress on the spontaneous movement of the working class, elevating the idea of a revolutionary general strike to be of paramount importance. And it was this overreaction, I think, that undoubtedly led to a series of errors. And one of them that's quite clear in the article is that she suggests that Lenin's conception of revolution resembles Blanquism, which is this kind of adventurous, substitutionalist idea that does not count on the direct action of the working class. And therefore, by this logic, it's not necessary to organize the people for the revolution. And Rosa was completely right in her criticism of Blanquism and its conspiratorial nature, as it makes, the revolutionary action the sole remit of a small section of cadres. But the fact is, it doesn't work, and Lenin understood this actually from day one. Revolutionaries must base themselves on the working class in order to see a successful socialist transformation of society, not least if the revolution is to succeed and be able to defend itself. The working class must, of course, play an active and conscious role within the revolution, and that's exactly what we saw in the Bolshevik Revolution. But for all these mistakes, I think they can certainly be traced back to a genuinely revolutionary instinct, as Victoria has brilliantly spoken about, as well as this boundless faith in the creative power of the working class, and this unerring hostility towards the careerists and the bureaucrats. Rosa Luxemburg at heart, was an internationalist Marxist, and she had a lot more in common, despite the distortions, than she did with Kautsky, or that she did with Parvus, or that she did with Bernstein and a lot of members of the German SDP. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Karl. I think that's an incredibly important point, and it's incredibly common to try and make make Rosa Luxemburg kind of like almost this kind of reformist leader and an icon in many respects. I don't think you find it that much among the British left in my experience, but especially like the German left, there is this real, trying like, oh, Lenin, he was this evil man who, wanted a revolution and to, destroy all of the bourgeois. But Rosa Luxemburg wanted like some kind of like peaceful way, which, was incredibly democratic and got everyone involved. Of course, in many respects, there's no difference between the two if you understand really what revolution is. But no, it's quite incredible. So whilst when I was in Die Linke last year, many of the lefts were more than happy to, wrap themselves up in the colors of Rosa Luxemburg. But, then if you said Lenin, looking away in horror, which I think is a real shame on actually how she is, how she is remembered, and shows that very few people actually understand her ideas at all. So on that point, Victoria, we've had a few questions coming in. So I think one of them from Anonymous, often writer on the internet, was 1918 the end of the German Revolution? What do you make of that?
Yeah, so I think that, again, that's an excellent question. It ties into what the people contributing have said in particular. And I think, I can't remember the quote off the top of my head, but Marx gave a very good quote about counter-revolution and revolution, the relationship between the two. Counter-revolution will come after revolution, obviously, but it gives rise again to another bout of revolution, which is exactly what we saw after 1919 in Germany. This wasn't an isolated period, as the other comrades have brilliantly explained. And I think, again, it would have changed the course of the situation had the workers not been so sorely defeated. We saw things. We saw strikes happening in 1920. We saw with the Kaputsch March, there was counter-revolution in 1920, as I said. There was an uprising in Hamburg in 1921. And this all culminated in the crisis in 1923 as well. All of which, every stage, there was an opportunity for the workers to have seized power. But again, as I said, and the other comrades have said, it was a crisis of revolutionary leadership. There wasn't a leadership in place that was organized to channel the energy of the workers and the movement of the workers to see it to its logical conclusions. 1917 proved the power of the workers, in Russia, 1917 proved the power of the workers to be able to take power, to overthrow the system, and to maintain it. And I think that the same could have been the case in Germany. And as I mentioned, due to how industrially advanced Germany was, by comparison to Russia, the situation, had the revolution been successful, could have been very different. Trotsky developed the theory of the law of combined uneven development, which I think is quite pertinent here. In Russia, for instance, you had a very backwards country, underdeveloped in terms of capitalism, and so in that sense, overthrowing it was slightly easier than would be a more advanced capitalist country. But what happened in Russia was then the workers were less experienced, so they couldn't then. They struggled to kind of consolidate that power, their power. But in Germany, you had a much more advanced working class, more experienced, because of how capitalism had developed the workforce. So although harder to overthrow more advanced German capitalism, once overthrown, it would have been easier to maintain a hold on that because of the skills and experience of the workers. I also wanted there's another question here, I don't think I made it live, but it touches on, so it raises a question of whether Luxemburg and Liebknecht should have remained in Germany, or they should have gone into exile and in Switzerland. And I think it's an interesting question. I think I'm not sure exactly it's the time frame they're referring to, but I think in 1919, after the Spartacus uprising, they obviously went into hiding. I think had they not been killed, there would have been a lot that they could have done, especially Luxemburg. She would have had the experience, the authority to train up the new German Communist Party to hopefully change the situation. I think, I'm not sure if they're referring to the exile happening before the war, but I think if that is what they're referring to, then I think that is unlikely to be successful, because you need, as I said, to be in the workers' movement, to be in the workers' struggle, participating in that. But if anyone wants to expand on that a little bit more, or if anyone knows a little bit more, by all means. But those are the questions that I wanted to respond to, and the comments. I did also, Khaled raised a point about sort of Rosa going against Lenin and sort of the ideas of Marxism, which obviously isn't true. For instance, she wrote the John Lewis pamphlet, I think, or the Unius pamphlet, that's it, when she was in prison. And Lenin greeted this as kind of the first sort of real coherent criticism of the war by the Marxist left, well, by the left in Germany. You know, and other things as well. Obviously there were mistakes in theory made by Rosa. For instance, there was something, she questioned the tactics of the Bolsheviks. I can't remember what's the specifics, but you know, questions like that came because she was very isolated. The Spartakists were an isolated group in Germany. Rosa was in prison for a lot of the period of the build-up. And what happens when you're isolated from the workers' movement, from discussion, ultimately, perspectives can become slightly muddied. And so things like her emphasis on the spontaneity, that in essence is right. The workers do move of their own fruition. They can't be forced to move. But Rosa Luxemburg kind of veered more into spontaneity because she was kind of countering the other sort of reformist ideas and other ideas, like ultra-left ideas as well. So she pushed in that direction because of the material conditions of the time that she was dealing with inside the SPD. But yeah, those are my contributions for now, anyway.
No, I think very, very excellently said. And I think one of the key things as well on on that question, I found that question on what's the word, on if we should have or if Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht should have run away. I found it very interesting because I think I think there's a very strong argument that if they'd been prepared to be brought back during when the revolutionary wave was back in its upswing, they could have played a very strong role. But I think the real key thing that we see as well is I mean, like any individual's life in such a difficult situation can very easily be ended in that respect. But the problem is that once we lost Luxemburg and Liebknecht, there was no one really to take their place. And you saw continual mistakes. For example, Paul Levy, who came to basically be the chairman of the leader of the KPD afterwards, made the mistake of basically expelling half the party on ultra-left grounds rather than trying to win them over, and then ended up actually finding himself outside the party. And then when you had the leadership of the later leadership of Tailman and the other Stalinists, they again participated in completely traitorous acts to the working class. So on that note, I've just brought Laurie in, who has another contribution, and then afterwards I'm going to be bringing Harvey Dodds in. If again anyone else wants to raise their hands, please do, or please submit more questions. But we are starting to approach the end as we have a sharp 1:30 finish. So Laurie, take it away.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think we've talked quite a lot about the role of a revolutionary party and its relationship with the mass movement. But I think this is very important to discuss, and the comparison between the German and the Russian revolutions is very instructive on this question, because we often talk about the need for a revolutionary leadership. But I think it is not enough to kind of say the problem is there was no revolutionary leadership, or the problem is the party was young, it didn't understand how to be a revolutionary leadership. We need to kind of explain concretely what that means. Otherwise, it just becomes a sentence that we repeat. And I think Cal has already touched on this point, but it's a very common slander against Marxists that, we don't have any faith in the masses and we think that they need to be led by the nose to a revolution. And this sort of caricature of a vanguard party that is promoted by anarchists and liberals alike. But actually, I think all Marxists should understand that it's not the maneuvers of individuals that make history, make revolutionary history, at least. It's the movement of the masses. And this was shown in 1918. You know, it did not require the urging of Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin to spark the Kiel mutiny and the 1918 uprising that turned into a revolution. The mass movement would have happened with or without revolutionary leadership. And this is the same with any mass movement. Ultimately, it's not triggered by clever agitation and clever slogans or whatever you want, but by like the boiling over of pressure within the working class. When workers can't live as before, there is no option but to move. But the role of a revolutionary organization really is to provide a leadership that is trained in Marxist ideas and has the clear perspective of the seizure of power by the working class. Their role is to provide direction to the mass movement and to ensure that the working class can move as one in its full power. And this, I think, was the difference between the revolutionary party that the Bolsheviks built and the party that existed in Germany. You know, in the middle of the Second World War, the Bolshevik party was also almost completely cut off from the movement within Russia. The outbreak of the war had completely cut across the organization. The most militant workers had been sent to the front. You know, Lenin was in exile. It was almost impossible to get literature across the border. But the Bolshevik party had been building in Russia for decades. They had deep roots in the working class. And this dated back, you know, even as far as the 1905 revolution, which was an unfortunately a failed insurrection that had occurred the decade before. And unlike the German Social Democratic Party, their party hadn't been broken by the betrayal of the leadership. The Bolshevik Party was one of only 2 parties in the Second International, I believe, that refused to vote for the war. So when the masses started to move again, when like revolutionary ideas came back to the fore, the most militant layers were already looking towards the Bolsheviks. And this ain't a process that we know a lot about because it was happening, you know, in the middle of the war in the army and the navy. But the Okhrana, the Russian secret police, has files that talk about the sort of social democratic cells that were set up within the navy, that they had no contact with like the RSDLP or the Bolshevik party, but they consistently were kind of trying to make contact and looking towards their old organizations. And then again, you know, after the February Revolution, like in Germany, you had a situation where there was kind of dual power set up in Russia, as there was after the 1918 revolution in Germany. And Lenin, instead of breaking off and forming a new party, despite the fact that he was really the only person within the Bolsheviks that understood the necessity for socialist revolution at that point, he came back to Russia and he agitated within the party and won over the rank and file cadres, not just to the bourgeois democratic revolution, but to socialist revolution. And this was vital because it was a concrete factor in the situation. This party had great authority within the working class, and they had cadres that were steeled and trained in the class struggle. This is very unlike the situation that Luxemburg and Liebknecht found themselves in with this new party. Luxemburg and the Spartacists did not have the ear of the masses of the workers. Many of the lairs of the workers were confused by the betrayal of the Second International or by the centrist ideas of Kautsky and the USDP, I think it was called, I've forgotten already. But furthermore, they didn't really have the authority to play the key role of a revolutionary organization, which is to like draw the layers of the working class together in struggle. And, you know, as Victoria explained, in a revolution, the class doesn't move as one. It has different layers that come to understand the need for revolution at a different pace. And it's a serious danger that the most advanced cadres and the revolutionary youth get cut off and they move too soon. And this is what happened in the German Revolution. This was the big distinction between the Russian and the German revolutions. Lenin and the Bolsheviks had the authority in July 1917 to explain to the most advanced workers they needed to wait a little bit for more of the class to get on board, to move. And actually, it was only a matter of months before this happened. But Luxemburg and Liebknecht's party didn't have that perspective or that history among the workers. And this leadership is what it takes to turn a general mass insurrectionary mood into the successful seizure of power. So we can see now that revolutionary leadership is not this trite little phrase that we use to explain why revolutions failed. I'm summing up now, Thomas. Sorry, I didn't see your message. It's a concrete historical factor which carries out very important tasks within a mass movement, and it's something that must be built not in the middle of a revolution, but in advance. No Marxist today would claim that the Revolutionary Party creates the mass movement. Just look at 2019 and the mass movement across Latin America. There was a revolutionary wave that swept across the continent, and it challenged the very base of the system. In Ecuador, the masses even arrested the police, posing the question of state power. But all those countries are still capitalist today, because without the Marxist Party, without the connections in the working class, without the cadres trained in the ideas of class struggle, there was nothing to channel that revolutionary energy into concrete action. So we must build that revolutionary leadership. It's been repeated, but I think we must understand exactly what it is that we're building. It's not an abstract little thing. It plays the vital historical role in the revolution. That's all.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Okay, we have 13 minutes, and then we have to end because there's no other option. So I'm bringing Harvey in now. If you can make a short and sweet lead off, and we may hopefully be able to get Ollie and Martine in as well. So Harvey, if you can please take it away.
Hi, comrades. Firstly, just thank you very much, Victoria, for that lead off. It was very thorough. The thing I wanted to just come on quickly and emphasise, but both yourself and Tom already have, but I don't actually think it can be emphasised enough, is that this just discussing Germany in 1918. It's not just purely an academic discussion topic. The Bolsheviks knew, and they were banking on the fact that if Germany was won, Europe was won, and the world would have been won. Trotsky described Germany's precarity national situation. Lenin didn't complete the conclusion to a polemic against Kautsky that he was writing because, he thought the German Revolution was going to be successful and therefore it wasn't needed, And as Thomas has already pointed out, these events mark perhaps the most pivotal 30 years of human history today, because the failure of the working class to take power in Germany at this time, it had real and enormous consequences. 85 million dead in World War II. That was 3% of the world's population. And how many died of the Great Depression as well during this time. But I mean, even today, right, the reason why we're having this meeting on Zoom, this pandemic, could have largely been avoided or at least minimised if, we'd ended capitalism a century ago and had a planned economy now and workers' democracy. And I think, as Victoria said, it's not an exaggeration to say that had the events of Germany of 1918 or 1920 or 1923 even turned out differently, the world would have been a very different place today. So, if we think of theory as the crystallized experience of the working class, this isn't just a historical discussion, but it's a very vital theoretical one. So what are the theoretical lessons? And I think, the main lesson to draw out is that, an emphasis on spontaneity, which is a fatal mistake. And that's a point which has been made throughout this discussion, but I think that shows how important it is. And I also think, it's not just that we should learn from Luxemburg and Liebknecht's errors. It's that they actually wanted us to. They wanted us to learn from the errors. They wanted us to correct them, and they wanted us to win. So I'll just begin to end, with a quote that shows this, and which I think should inspire everyone. And it's from Liebknecht's last ever article. And he says, the vanquished of today will be the victors of tomorrow. For this defeat will be their instruction. Whether we still live when the end is attained, our program will live. It will rule the world of a saved humanity in spite of it all. And I think if we want to truly honour the legacy, we need to get involved in building up the forces of Marxism. And, as I said last week, I think today that's best represented, in my opinion, by, the IMT internationally and in Britain by the Socialist Appeal. And I think if people have been inspired by the discussion today and indeed the Revolution series so far, they should get involved with that. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Harvey. That was very, very excellent contribution. So I did have Ollie wanting to come in, but he seems to have lowered his hand. No, his hand is back up, so he is going to come in right now. If he's very quick, we may be able to take on Martine, but I'm not sure. So we will see. I do also want to give a bit of time for Victoria to sum up. But again, in 10 minutes, this talk does end. No questions asked. So Frank, can you please take it away? Ollie.
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'll try and be quick. I just wanted to make a point that I think kind of echoes some of the points that comrades have made before, particularly kind of Harvey's point just then, and Laurie as well made a very good point that I want to kind of bring out a bit, because I think a lot, as other people have said, it can seem a little bit abstract when we're talking about the German Revolution and about kind of historical revolutions and stuff like that. But there are very important parallels between the situation back then and the situation now that can actually concretely inform how we approach workers' movements and how we approach society more generally. And I think the main point is that conditions, it was over 100 years ago, but conditions then do bear important parallels to conditions now. Obviously, back then, you had the First World War, but you had widespread social and economic turmoil, you had conflict, you had the working class being kind of deeply exploited and entrenched across society. And the conditions coming out of the First World War were not unlike the conditions that we're seeing today, both in terms of general social and economic collapse, but also more specifically, if you look at something like the coronavirus pandemic in the world right now, and the kind of absolute crash and collapse of global economies, of global infrastructure and society and stuff like that. These are the conditions that led to very kind of rapid and very significant changes in the consciousness of working people. And I think that's one of the really key things that we learn from the kind of interwar period, or the beginning of the interwar period, that a kind of series, a kind of global crisis on a mass scale causes very dramatic shifts in the consciousness of individuals, and in the consciousness particularly of the worst off in those societies, which are the working class. And I think this shows more than ever that we need to build in advance of that. These changes are going to come. The crisis is not going away, and the crisis is, if anything, going to be on a far greater scale than it was in the period leading up to the German Revolution. And as comrades have mentioned before, we cannot allow ourselves to kind of be caught by surprise by these movements. We cannot allow ourselves to not have the structures of a Bolshevik organization, the structures of revolutionaries organized in advance of those. Because if we do have them in advance, if we do not have them in advance, it will lead to the exact failures that we saw in the German Revolution, not just in terms of the overall failure of their desire to achieve socialism, but in the kind of the childhood illnesses, the kind of teething problems of the young German Communist Party. And I think, if anything that we can take away from that, to sum up, what we can take away is that we need to do these things. We need to build in advance of the changes of consciousness. We can't wait for consciousness to change before we build. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ollie. That was an excellent contribution. I wish we could have had more, but we are a bit pushed for time. So I'm going to go to Victoria. If you can sum up this discussion, it's been a whirlwind of one, so probably a very difficult task. But yes, if you can take it away, and you have about 4 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I won't talk for too long. I thought those contributions were excellent. In particular, Laurie's sort of emphasis on the difference between the leadership in Germany and the leadership in Russia, which I think is essential. I think in particular it's important for us when we say like leadership, and in the light of the current situation, obviously it can be easy seeing a meeting like this, or attending another society meeting that Marxist societies put on, to think we're a discussion group. But what we're building for is not abstract. We're in the working class movement, and we're fighting for the same things that Rosa and Karl Liebknecht and the other revolutionaries are fighting for. And I think obviously this revolution, the German Revolution, was unfortunately unsuccessful. But I think, as the others have said, there is so much to learn from it, and we should take inspiration from it, especially for the current period. We've entered the deepest crisis of capitalism today, and I think we're going to see when the masses decide to move, which they will, nothing will be able to stop them. So periods like the period following World War I, through the 20s, again following World War II, in the 70s after the oil crisis, 1973, 1974, again 2008. All of these events, they prove that revolution can happen, and a revolutionary wave can spread internationally. And for me, that is incredibly inspiring to see that has happened in the past again and again. Consciousness, as Ollie said, it develops obviously in periods of capitalist upswing. It is slow to develop. Consciousness is slow to change, but when it does, it catches up with a bang. And I think what we're going to see in the coming period, there's a necessity to build and to prepare. So we can prize foresight over astonishment, as Ollie also said, and not be thrown off course by events when they do arrive. So yeah, I would just end by saying that we should focus on how inspirational an event like this is, and also put a real emphasis on learning from the errors as well. Yeah, that's everything from me.
Well, thank you very much, Victoria. It's been a really, really fantastic discussion. And I believe there will be a similar discussion at the same time next week as on the Chartists, apparently. I'm not entirely sure, but there will be one next week. Don't want to spread fake news, but that definitely is true. On the Easter Rising next week, which was the revolutionary movements in 1916 in Ireland, and incredibly important, especially for those in Britain, to understand the revolutionary traditions of Britain and Ireland. So I highly recommend everyone coming along to this. I highly recommend getting involved with the IMT, as I think everyone has made very, very clear. And to keep following our work. And until then, solidarity forever, guys. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
We're living through a decisive turning point in history. Tens of thousands of people are dying. The world economy is in freefall. This is the barbarism of the capitalist system. It can't be patched up. It must be replaced. We have the resources to meet everyone's needs and the planet's. A rational, planned, socialist economy is possible. A society based on need, not profit. But we have to fight for it. We need to get educated in revolutionary theory and history. We need to spread our ideas, and we need to organise ourselves. So join Socialist Appeal, the Marxist and the Labour and student movement. Join our study groups, spread our online material, and start getting organised with us. We're faced with an historic challenge and an historic opportunity. Seize this moment. Change the world.